All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. This afternoon, we're actually going to be treated to a wonderful overview of Book of Mormon history by Jack Welch and Kirk Magleby. And even though the order of our presentations is somewhat backwards, I'm essentially going to pick up where they will leave off. They're going to bring us up to the present as far as the history of Book of Mormon research, and I'm going to be projecting a bit into the future in so much as possible. It's admittedly a difficult task to try to predict what will be happening in Book of Mormon studies in years to come. I thought maybe the most reasonable way of approaching this would be to approach scholars who are actively involved in Book of Mormon research, that are committed to doing good scholarship, and who I anticipate will continue to be publishing into the future. Most of what I have to say here today was really based on input that I received from the likes of Robert Millett, Thomas Wayment, Sean Hopkin, Bill Hamblin, Carrie Hull, Brian Hoglid, Brant Gardner, Nick Frederick, Joe Spencer, John Hilton III, and Amy Easton Flake. Some of those names you know, some of those you probably don't. Those you don't, you will probably will in coming years. They are doing exciting work. Now, despite their extremely diverse academic background, some of them do 19th century literature, others focus on theology, some do ancient Near Eastern studies. I found that there actually was a great deal of overlap in where they hope to see the field go into the future. The one hope that they all shared was that we can actually move the Book of Mormon scholarship more into mainstream academia. There have been some exciting developments in recent years in Mormon studies in general, such as the establishment of Mormon Studies program at such prestigious institutions as Claremont or most recently the University of Virginia. But the academic study of the Book of Mormon itself oftentimes is not part of those programs. Mormon studies in general is dominated by church history. Very little attention is paid to the actual scriptures. One exception, of course, is the Book of Mormon as literature class. It's being taught by David Bakovoy at the University of Utah. It's the first of its kind. It's actually garnered some national attention. It's been written about or talked about on everything from Fox News to the Huffington Post and everything in between. This literary approach is just one of the many novel ways in which the Book of Mormon is being approached. Now, I'm afraid in some ways this presentation might be like drinking water from a fire hose. I'm admittedly going for breadth rather than depth here, just to give you a general sense of what's going on in the field. There's a lot happening. And to be clear, I'm not here simply to discuss what may be termed orthodox approaches, but rather I want to inform you about all of the different types of approaches that we might expect to see in the future, whether we like them or not. I recently helped organize what we dubbed the Book of Mormon think tank at the Maxwell Institute. I don't know if I have my slides here. At this think tank, we kind of broke the Book of Mormon down into several categories. I know it's hard to see here, but we have the basic categories: the world behind the text, the world of the text, the world in front of the text, and the Book of Mormon and the Academy. The world behind the text is kind of the traditional approach that we've done, the Old World studies, the New World Mesoamerican studies, but also a part of that is 19th century studies as well now. The world of the text, that's where we're building a critical text like Skousen has done, looking at the Book of Mormon as literature and even as comparative text. The world in front of the text, we're looking at the Book of Mormon as a canonical text and as a received text. In other words, how has it been received by members of the church at different eras in our history, and as a theological text. And then finally, we had a session on the Book of Mormon and the Academy, where we were looking forward to Book of Mormon in Mormon studies itself. Again, it's primarily dominated by church history rather than scriptural studies. And then trying to extend that out to the Book of Mormon in the larger field of religious studies. And then even things like the Book of Mormon and gender. You'd think maybe there wouldn't be much to do with that, but there actually are some exciting work that has been done in those regards. We had a wide range of scholars there, from those like me who are convinced that it's a historical text to others who weren't so sure and others who just simply didn't care. But the meetings themselves were characterized by civil discourse. We actually enjoyed each other's company despite our wide range of opinions. Now, I admit that it actually broadened my perspective as to the value of other types of research. I've always been kind of a, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and to me, Mesoamerica is my hammer. Now, I have no interest in pursuing myself research concerning the Book of Mormon that brackets the historicity. But I do actually recognize the value of such approaches. I want people to get excited about the Book of Mormon, and not everybody gets excited about archaeology. I don't understand why, right? But honestly, I think whatever we can do to get people's noses in the book, it's worth the effort. If we want them to be touched by the Spirit as they read from the pages, they first have to read from the pages. So let's not discourage anyone from doing research, even if they think they need to bracket the historicity question. So one of these approaches is a doctrinal or theological approach. Robert Millett discussed with me that he would like to see more books about the specific doctrine of the Book of Mormon, our unique LDS perspectives on its theology aimed at a non-Mormon audience. He worded it this way: I'm surprised that some enterprising student of the Book of Mormon hasn't prepared a book, written for those not of our faith, that focuses on the distinctive theology of the book, that highlights its teachings on such matters as the oneness of the Godhead, the nature of fallen man, the infinite scope of the atonement, salvation by grace, being born again, the proper care of wealth, the destiny of the house of Israel, divine versus human knowledge, the Bible and the promise of other scriptural records, etc. Close quote. This book is actually much more theologically complex than maybe we've given it credit for in the past. Joe Spencer is doing wonderful work in shedding light on that aspect of the book. If that's not a name you're familiar with, you will be soon. He wrote a book called An Other Testament. It's a thin little book, and it takes a lot longer to read than you think. It is thin, but it is meaty. And if you really want your mind expanded as to the theological depth of the Book of Mormon, I can't recommend it highly enough. It was originally published by Salt Press. It's now being reissued through the Maxwell Institute. Now, thanks to the tireless work of Royal Skousen over the past couple of decades, we have a critical text of the Book of Mormon. Anyone doing serious research needs to be working from Royal's texts. What type of textual work remains to be done then? Structurally, we've barely touched the text. A couple of attempts have been made at creating speaker's editions of the Book of Mormon, which typically use formatting and marginal notations to clearly indicate who is speaking at any given moment throughout the book. And it actually is surprisingly helpful in keeping the story straight when you know exactly who is speaking at any given moment. Hopefully such editions will be made available one day. They're trying to get clearance. But beyond just knowing who the speakers are at any given moment, we need to better identify and delineate the different types of texts that are present in the book. Epistles, proclamations, sermons, edited works, quotations, blessings, etc. Why bother? What's the point? Because a lot can be learned when we compare and contrast these different types of works to see if there's any statistically significant differences between their composition. A paper just came across my desk for review in the past week, looking at chiasmus. Some critics of the church have suggested that you can find chiasmus anywhere if you look hard enough. And so they essentially attributed its appearance in the Book of Mormon by accident. And so this author went through and looked to see if it appears in predictable places. And it turns out we find it in sermons very regularly and predictably, but we don't find it in letters or in other types of discourse. And that's significant. It shows that it's not an accidental thing. But again, we need to do a better job of delineating the different types of text within the Book of Mormon in order to do these types of analyses. So the structure itself demands more research. Why is there a second Nephi when it's still Nephi writing? We don't have a second Alma. And for that matter, why does Alma not end in Alma 44 when Helaman takes over the record in Alma 45? 45 through 62 are written by Helaman. It's almost a third of the book. We still have a lot to learn when it comes to the structure itself of the Book of Mormon. Now, when we do a meta-analysis of the Book of Mormon, we need to be careful to distinguish between the small plates, Mormon's record, Moroni's record. The book that we have is not the same book that Mormon wrote. We're missing the first 116 pages. The way he structured it started with the Book of Lehi, and then he ends up adding in the small plates. But we have to assume that Mormon carefully constructed his book, and unfortunately, due to the lost 116 pages, that structure, some of that structure may have been lost. Go to the next slide here. If we want the study of the Book of Mormon to be taken seriously by academic standards, we really need to abide by academic methodologies. In the religion department, we actually have assembled a small group of faculty comprised of some junior faculty and some senior faculty. We're calling it the Book of Mormon Academy. And what we're trying to do is jumpstart the study of the Book of Mormon in the religion department. And one thing that we did recently was we all read a book on biblical exegesis. We had S. Kent Brown come and talk to us a little bit about those approaches. And in discussing these different approaches, it occurred to us that it might be fun as sort of an academic exercise to see if we could apply these different approaches, not just generally to the Book of Mormon, but to take a specific pericope from the Book of Mormon. Let's take the Abinadi account, for example. And we may or may not follow through on this, but it was kind of a fun thought exercise. So, textual criticism. That's when you try to find the original wording, and Royal, again, has pretty much done the work on that for us. But what if we were also to subject it to historical criticism? And again, just speaking specifically about the Abinadi narrative, to try to situate it in its original time and place. What could Mesoamerican scholarship add to our understanding of that particular account? Could Mesoamerican beliefs in deity complexes or multiple manifestations of a single deity help us understand Abinadi's somewhat confusing description of Christ as both Father and Son, flesh and spirit? Or could it help us understand Abinadi's martyrdom a little bit better, in conjunction with Skousen's textual criticism that informs us that Abinadi was scorched to death with faggots rather than being scourged to death, since we find ancient images of captives in Mesoamerica being killed by having torches repeatedly pressed against them until they succumbed to death. Or perhaps we could attempt a grammatical criticism, wherein we analyze Abinadi's semantics, or look into his rhetoric using literary criticism, or use form criticism to ascertain what genre of literature this fits into within the Book of Mormon, or tradition criticism, wherein we explore the particular theology espoused by Abinadi and contrast it with that of earlier and later prophets. Are there any differences? Or redaction criticism. How is Mormon's hand evident in shaping this particular narrative to conform to his overarching vision of the text? Or structuralist criticism, wherein we take an atemporal look at universal themes in Abinadi's teachings, how the modern reader connects to the deep structures of the text that transcend specific cultural contexts, the fundamental binary opposition between good and evil, human and divine, and the tension that the person of Christ embodies from a structuralist perspective. He is Father and Son, he is flesh and spirit, he is human and divine. And this approach will give us a very different insight than what we talked about with the historical criticism, for example, but perhaps equally interesting. And finally, canonical criticism. How do Abinadi's teachings fit into the theology of the Book of Mormon as a whole, or even with the expanded canon that our church enjoys? Now, biblical scholarship can also be used to, as we re-examine biblical passages within the Book of Mormon. For example, what light can current Isaiah scholarship give us on the shared Isaiah chapters? David Bokovoy is currently putting the finishing touches on a book about the documentary hypothesis in relation to to Genesis through Deuteronomy. And this, of course, will have relevance to the Book of Mormon as a whole, and even to our understanding of the brass plates. Along those lines, more work needs to be done in examining intertextuality between the Bible and the Book of Mormon. Biblical passages are woven throughout the Book of Mormon from start to finish, beyond just the obvious Isaiah sections, and they do demand closer scrutiny. Some work has been done in identifying which passages are directly quoted, or at least alluded to, but to be honest, not enough has been done in answering why they are there, especially when it comes to New Testament passages that crop up prior to the visit of Christ. We shouldn't shy away from such questions, by the way. We need to tackle them head on, and we need qualified scholars to do it. Fascinating work is being done examining intertextuality within the Book of Mormon itself. In other words, when later prophets hearken back to the words of earlier prophets, either explicitly or implicitly. John Hilton III from BYU is doing exciting work using word cruncher technology that is finding previously undetected examples where prophets in the Book of Mormon either directly quote or make subtle allusions to the teachings of earlier prophets. For example, when Alma is preaching to the people of Ammonihah, he hearkens into King Benjamin's words, but when he counsels his son Corianton, he emphasizes the words of Abinadi. Now, a number of scholars I spoke to highlighted the need to create a more sophisticated chronology and a detailed historical geography of the Book of Mormon. For example, Bill Hamblin emphasized that we need to carefully study when toponyms appear, when they disappear, their geographical relationships to each other, and at different times and in different places. Kirk Magleby has actually done some work in this regard. Dr. Hamblin would also like to see more research that brings together the chronologies of the ancient Near East, the Book of Mormon, and Mesoamerica in a way that makes them all fit together logically. Brant Gardner, Carrie Hull, and I, Mesoamericanists all, we all agree that closer attention to chronology will also allow us to trace the acculturation of the Nephites into their New World environment. We frankly don't expect to see much Mesoamerican influence in the writings of Nephi or Jacob, for example. But by the time we get to Omni, I think it really begins to show through. But I haven't studied it systematically, neither has anyone else. But it needs to be done. Another exciting project is the Book of Mormon Onomasticon, the study of names. The Maxwell Institute recently launched a website with an online onomasticon. It's a complete database of names from the Book of Mormon with suggested etymologies for each. The names can be sorted alphabetically and in reverse alphabetical order, which is useful when analyzing suffixes. They have a chart which breaks down which plates each of the names comes from the brass plates, small plates, plates of Mormon, etc. It notes which names are Nephite, which are Lamanite, Mulekite, Jaredite, etc. Now this is useful. For example, it seems that names that start with Kor, like K-O-R or C-O-R, are Jaredite derivatives that work their way into Mulekites and then later into Nephites. Naming practices. So there is still so much to be done with the onomastics, and this database is a phenomenal resource, just waiting to be mined. Now, of course, the approach to the Book of Mormon that is nearest and dearest to my heart is obviously Mesoamerican archaeology. That's what gets me excited, and I know this crowd, and that's what gets most of you excited. We read it, and to us, it is so obvious that Mesoamerica is the right place. It's just dripping with Mesoamerican culture. And even though we've been at it for 50 or 60 years, there is just still so much yet to be done. Now, one of the limitations of Book of Mormon archaeology is simply the paucity of available data. Let me go to my next slide here. This is George Stewart. He was National Geographic's resident Mayanist for basically the latter half of the 20th century. His son is David Stewart, the world's leading Mayan epigrapher. Just earlier this year, he was interviewed, and he said, "Truth is, we don't know squat. There's about 6,000 known Maya sites, and we've only researched about 5% of them." Now, I actually was talking to George just a few months before he did this interview. I was in North Carolina at a conference, and I asked him, I said, "George, we'd just seen a presentation with new satellite imagery that revealed kind of these 6,000 sites." And I said, "George, how much of this have we excavated?" And he held up one finger, and he said, "And that's why we don't know." And he didn't say squat, but he did say something that started with an S. He's not a Latter-day Saint, obviously. Now, let's say the number is somewhere between 1% and 5%. That means we've excavated, or not even excavated, but at least researched anywhere from between 60 at the low end to 300 at the high end of Mayan sites. So that means there are between 5,700 and 5,940 sites out of 6,000 that we haven't studied. And that's why we don't know squat. Now, to be fair, more and more sites are being excavated and the reports are being published. But we're still only talking about a dozen or two sites, not hundreds and certainly not thousands. But with each of these reports comes new information, which allows us to make stronger arguments, especially when it comes to pre-classic period sites. As many of you know, I'm not a huge fan of specific geography when it comes to the Book of Mormon. I don't care if it's the Grijalva or the Usumacinta. I don't know, it doesn't matter to me. But I think that as we get more and more survey and excavation reports, we might be able to home in on Zarahemla. Carrie Hull, a very well-respected Mayanist who just recently joined the Ancient Scripture faculty at BYU in the last couple of months, he commented to me that more research needs to be done in determining ancient geographical landscapes in Mesoamerica, with a special focus on hydrology. This is something that hadn't really occurred to me. He noted that core samples from the Veracruz region indicate that anciently it used to be far more swampy, and the lake covered a much greater area, and there were more of them, which of course has implications for discussions concerning the narrow neck and perhaps even the meaning of seas. essentially between the mountain and the sea, if the swamp is, 20 miles instead of a few miles, it makes the pass much narrower, so to speak. Now, I'll note also that the lowland region of Guatemala, known as Petén, one of these areas that had more water in it than currently does now, the word Petén is the Maya word for island. It's an ancient word, and that word, the designation Petén or island, has been used since at least the classic period. And that perhaps adds extra significance to Jacob's words in 2 Nephi 10:20 that says, "We are upon an isle of the sea." Now, I mentioned there are those who think we should bracket the question of historicity in our study of the Book of Mormon, whereas others see that as a fatal mistake. My personal stance is that those who feel they need to bracket the historicity in their own research should feel free to do so, but they should respect that academic approaches to the historicity question are valid and worth pursuing. Placing the events of the Book of Mormon in their historical context adds richness and depth to our understanding of the book. Those who feel we must focus exclusively on its 19th century origin, regardless of whether or not they deem it true, and completely ignore the ancient origins are simply myopic. No legitimate biblical scholar would ever suggest ignoring the historical context of the Bible. The Book of Mormon is an ancient book, and we cannot abandon that aspect of our study of it. Now, from what I've seen over the past couple of decades, a good number of the younger generation of ancient Near Eastern specialists we have in the church is because of the fact that they went to the Jerusalem Center, they got really excited about it, and they said, "I want to dedicate my life to this." We don't have any equivalent for Book of Mormon research. Now, this is perhaps a pipe dream, but I would love to see at some point in the future, maybe this is 20 or 30 or 100 years away, a Book of Mormon center for Mesoamerican research, maybe housed in Antigua, Guatemala, just because I like that city. This next section is, well, hopefully it doesn't come across as being harsh. But as many of you are aware, I was recently named an associate editor of the Journal Book of Mormon Studies at the Maxwell Institute. We're going to take it back to its original name. For the past few years, it's been called the Journal of the Book of Mormon and Other Restoration Scriptures, which we abbreviate to JB S'mores. But we want to return the focus to the Book of Mormon. The editorial board is Brian Hoglid as the editor, and then Joe Spencer and I as the associate editors. I want to assure you that the journal is not abandoning its ancient approach, but rather it is adding in other approaches as well. But I will not allow them to take away the historicity thing, because that's my bread and butter. That's what I love. But I'm also, aside from being an associate editor of the Journal of the Book of Mormon Studies, I'm also very proud that I'm a contributing editor and a founding member of the Interpreter Journal. And I'm also a member of the board of directors here at the Book of Mormon Archaeological Forum. And due to those commitments, I have a fairly steady stream of papers that come across my desk for review, for publication in one venue or another. And some of these articles are absolutely thrilling and a joy to read. The one I just mentioned concerning chiasmus appearing in sermons but not in letters. It's exciting stuff. The data is good, the methodology is sound, and they lead naturally to reasonable conclusions. But far too many, however, are just terrible. I don't know how else to word it. They make really honestly preposterous claims based on decontextualized data and wild reinterpretations of well-known, understood archaeological materials. And I got to be honest, we do ourselves a disservice when we make wild claims. We will never be taken seriously by academia if we refuse to abide by academic standards. Now, along those lines, one of the more controversial topics concerning the future of Book of Mormon research is the role of apologetics, whether or not it should even be done at all, and how to do it. Now, for any who may be unfamiliar with the term, apologetics simply means a scholarly defense of the faith, and so for us, it's a scholarly defense of the Book of Mormon. My hope is that we can find a balance wherein we can defend the Book of Mormon without being defensive. I'm a Star Wars geek. This next slide, I think, represents what we sometimes do. We've got little Anakin there saying, "If you're not with me, then you're my enemy." And then Obi-Wan says, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes." Now, Obi-Wan is there speaking in an absolute, so I'm not sure what that says about him. But I worry when we label each other, good guys, bad guys. And I can't help but wonder if we as a church suffer from kind of a deep-seated persecution complex that leads us to assume that anytime someone raises a question about the Book of Mormon, that they must be seen as an anti-Mormon trying to attack us. Now, whether we like it or not, the study of the Book of Mormon now falls under the umbrella of the emerging field of Mormon studies, and more questions are going to be coming in the future. So we need to be part of the scholarly conversation without turning it into a shouting match. One of my colleagues in religious education, a well-respected scholar in his field, expressed concern that our attempt to quote-unquote prove the Book of Mormon actually demonstrates a profound insecurity about ourselves. We don't see Buddhists attempting to prove their sacred writings, and I don't think you'd ever hear an Islamic scholar marvel, how could Muhammad have known? Right? But let's not be afraid to acknowledge the plausibility of alternative explanations, even those that may be completely contrary to our own. If it's a sound argument, let's acknowledge it and attempt to address it fully and not turning it into a straw man. Brian Hogwood, the new director of the Willis Center and the newly appointed editor of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, mentioned to me that we should strive to be a little more open and honest about both the pros and the cons. Ignoring difficult issues does not make them go away, but when addressing the tough questions, let's make sure that we're not presenting our theories as facts. I'll admit I get nervous anytime I review an article wherein someone claims to have proven anything. I found that typically those that proclaim most boldly to have proof of something are those that present the weakest evidence and arguments, and using impossibly strong language. In mainstream archaeology, we use lots of qualifying words, such as maybe, perhaps, possibly. You won't find many archaeologists who claim to have proven anything. We'll return to that later, and what we know and don't know in archaeology. Several years ago, I had something of an epiphany regarding my own approach to apologetics. I realized that I'm not out to prove the Book of Mormon true, but I am out to prove it interesting. Along those lines, LDS philosopher Jim Faulkner suggested that richness is the new proof. I believe we can paint a vivid picture of the historicity of the Book of Mormon based on the wealth of information and confirming evidence that we already have, and we will continue to add to it as new evidence comes forth. I'm often asked what I think is the single most impressive piece of evidence for the Book of Mormon, but for me it really isn't a single piece of evidence, but rather it's the way the thousands of little puzzle pieces all fit together so perfectly to form a perfect picture. Now, continuing with that analogy, sometimes we discover that we've put a piece of the puzzle in that's the wrong piece, or it's in the wrong place. One of the most important things we can do to further the work of Book of Mormon studies is to acknowledge the mistakes of the past and to do our best to correct and move beyond them. It's okay to admit when we were wrong. Sometimes more recent scholarship will invalidate some of our previous arguments. That's just how science works. And it certainly doesn't disprove the Book of Mormon. Even Moroni asked that we cut the Book of Mormon a little slack on the title page when he said that if there are mistakes, they're the faults of men. Royal Skousen has found thousands upon thousands of flaws or changes or mistakes or whatever you want to call them. But we'll hear shortly that those supposed flaws have only deepened his testimony of the Book of Mormon and the prophet Joseph Smith. Hugh Nibley is a wonderful model of scholarly humility. Had this to say: I refuse to be held responsible for anything I wrote more than 3 years ago. For heaven's sake, I hope we're moving forward here. After all the implication that one mistake and it's all over with, how flattering to think in 40 years I have not made one slip and I'm still in business. I would say about 4/5 of everything I put down has changed, of course. That's the whole idea. This is an ongoing process. And I have some interesting examples of that, he says. So let me give you a specific example of something that we were wrong about in the past, that we should acknowledge and then just let go of it. And frankly, never ever try to use again as evidence for the Book of Mormon. I've entitled this, Kish This One Goodbye. This is the so-called Kish glyph. As the argument goes, this glyph here appears at Palenque. And essentially the argument is that it refers to an Olmec ruler in the distant past named Kish. And since the Olmec date to the time period of Jaredites, there was a Jaredite king named Kish. So then, therefore, the Palenque, the king mentioned in the text of Palenque is therefore the Jaredite king. The problem is this glyph is not read Kish. The glyph itself is a representation of a stingray spine, a very common element in Maya iconography due to their use as bloodletting implements. Thanks to advances in Maya epigraphy, we now know that the most likely reading of the stingray glyph is Kokan, not Kish. So where did the erroneous Kish reading come from? Back in 1976, when the decipherment of Maya glyphs was still in its infancy, Linda Sheely tentatively proposed a phonetic reading of Kish for this glyph, because that's the word for stingray spine in some modern Mayan languages. But it was always clear to epigraphers that Kish was intended to be more of a nickname, since there were no phonetic complements that supported that reading. Usually when that ruler's name would appear in the scholarly literature, it would be found with quotation marks around it, which is shorthand among epigraphers that denotes a nickname rather than a phonetic reading. We've come up with some crazy nicknames in the past. There's a ruler named Kopan Washaklahunubah Kawil, which means 18 are the images of Kawil. But his nickname was 18 Rabbit. Right? Before we knew how to read it, we called him 18 Rabbit. Now we know his name is Washaklahunubah Kawil. Very different reading, right? So, unfortunately, Bruce Warren came across this phonetic reading, saw Kish, the proposed reading of Kish for this mythological ruler, and he published and said that this might be a reference to this ruler in the Book of Mormon. Now, this is not in any way an attempt to diminish the legacy of Dr. Warren. He just passed away a few months ago, and he's one of our former recipients of the Father Lehi Award here at the BMAF, and we honor his legacy. But likewise, a great deal of Linda Sheely's work, upon which Bruce Warren based his arguments, is completely outdated at this point. And Sheely showed the same scholarly humility as Nibley did. She wanted people to prove her wrong. She wanted the field to move forward. And I can't think of a single reading that Linda Sheely proposed that is still accepted basically, letter by letter or glottal by glottal. Every single one of them has advanced beyond that. So the point is, we need to constantly update our arguments based on the best data available. The reason this is so critical is because when we base our arguments on bad data and or bad methods, which are easily disproven to the outsider, it makes it seem like the Book of Mormon itself has been disproven. In other words, if our proof that the Book of Mormon is true is the Kish glyph, and then it turns out that the Kish glyph isn't really the Kish glyph, then unbelievers think that proves the Book of Mormon false. But the problem isn't the book, the problem is the arguments that we make. Now, this is not in any way to suggest that all work on the Book of Mormon is somehow outdated. Dan mentioned that he had to change his topic. That was partly my fault, and I want to apologize to him again for that. But his original title was going to be On the Shoulders of Giants, and he was going to talk about the legacy of farms. And by and large, the material produced by farms stands the test of time. I mean, it is phenomenal work. It's the reason I'm here today. And not only farms, but BYU Studies, things produced by the Religious Studies Center at BYU, as well as other venues. Again, they've just stood the test of time well. But as Joe Spencer noted, we need to take serious stock of what's been done so that we don't just reinvent the wheel, and so that we can learn to appreciate more deeply all that has been done. To be honest, I can't count the number of times I've come up with what I think is some brilliant new insight about Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon, only to dig into the literature and discover that John Sorensen or Brant Gardner had somehow managed to publish my new idea years before I ever thought of it. Now, Carrie Hull, who I mentioned earlier, thought it was very important that I stress the limitations of archaeology and historical research, and I wholeheartedly agree. There's a misperception out there that archaeology is a fairly precise science, but I'm afraid that's not as true as we like. Here I want to quote the words of the Venerable Indiana Jones. He says, archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. If it's truth you're looking for, Dr. Tyree's philosophy class is right down the hall. Now, you can't see it, but down there I have Dr. Henry Indiana Jones, professor of archaeology, Marshall College, and then in parentheses I have fictional, but he's real to me. He and John Sorensen really are the reason that I'm here today. But this is overstated. When we talk about fact, there's a difference between real facts and archaeological facts. Dr. Hull gives the following example. If gold is found next to an individual in a burial, it could be an archaeological fact that gold existed in that society. Or maybe not. Maybe it was just traded up from another area. Does it signify the person was wealthy, or were they a thief? Or could it be that later generations added that into the tomb for some reason? Who's to say? Well, the archaeologist, using deductive reasoning based on all the quote-unquote facts before them, and this is where the subjective side of archaeology comes into play. The filling in process of interpretation is often what gets the headlines. In other words, quote, this cup found in this elite burial was used for rain-bringing ceremonies by this ritual priest. There's a joke in archaeology. If you dig something up, you don't know what it is, you say, this is a ritual object, right? I actually had a little bit of a crisis of archaeological faith years ago. When I was new in graduate school, and I decided to take a little trip over to Catalina, and I'm sitting on the beach, and this little kid starts grabbing these big stones. They're about yay big, and he puts them into a perfect, not even a perfect circle, to a nice little oval. They were all uniform in their size and shape, and he used 13 of them. And then he got bored and he ran away. And I just stared at it. I'm like, dude, if I dug that up, right, I would infer so much meaning. For the Maya, the back of a turtle, or the earth itself was the back of a turtle. And the turtle carapace actually has 13, I don't remember the word offhand, but there's 13 sections of a turtle shell. And so the number 13 is very significant to the Maya. The fact that this was near the seashore, obviously a representation of the primordial earth rising from the waters, right? And I realized this is all a sham, right? We just make everything up. And so I went into my professor that next weekend, and Wendy Ashmore, and she kind of talked me down a little bit. She's like, that's why we look for things like carbon scoring, were they doing any kind of offerings or anything like that? And then I said, yeah, but seriously, if you dug that up, and she was like, yeah, I would have made something of it. And that's what we do. And it's interesting, too, to see the way that our theories of the Maya collapse specifically follow social trends. We still don't know why the Maya collapsed, by the way. In the 70s, when there was sort of the backlash against Vietnam, the Maya had collapsed because of war. In the 90s, when Earth Day became popular, it was because they overforested, or they deforested their landscape, and that led to famine, and on and on. We can actually map social changes in American thought onto explanations of Maya collapse. It's really quite a fascinating study in and of itself. In one of our leading scholarly journals in archaeology, a non-LDS archaeologist named Mark Plusianik wrote the following, and again, I want to thank Carrie Hull for bringing my attention to this particular quote. Plusianik says, all archaeologists routinely use law-like causal explanation to explain outcomes related to the invariable properties of certain types of materials and processes, such as the taphonomy of a site, and may invoke broad ecological principles, for example, as well as using more contentious explanations, in quotes. Generalizations, analogies, and speculations derived from social theory, ethnography, ecology, or biology. So that's a fancy way of saying what I just said. It is at the general level of appropriateness of approach and attribution of possible meaning, the nature of plot and the type of narrative object constructed, that paradigmatic archaeological debates take place. Plusianik also mentioned that, quote, archaeology, like any other narrative objects, are post hoc constructions. In other words, we're imposing meaning on these objects that we dig up. And while they are and have been the dominant form in which the past is presented, yet for historical philosophies, philosophical reasons, there has been a tendency to analyze them only insofar as they can be treated as a form of explanation or knowledge analogous to that science. In other words, it's kind of the circular thing where we have this preconceived notion, we dig something up, and if it conforms to that, great. If not, we reimagine what it was for so it does conform. Simply put, there are actually a lot of debates in archaeology. If we were dealing with facts, there would be no debates. If there's a lot we don't know. We don't know squat, as George Stewart says, right? Now, on to a different subject. When I asked my fellow Book of Mormon scholars what they hope to see in the future with regards to Book of Mormon research, virtually all of them stated that they would like to see more comprehensive reference materials, both in print and in electronic formats. Most of our commentaries tend to focus on doctrinal issues or kind of another subset, but there needs to be more comprehensive academic, encyclopedic reference works. Brant Gardner's 6-volume commentary was a very ambitious attempt, and I recommend everyone buy a complete set, by the way. I don't get any royalties from that, but I think it's fantastic. But what we really need is more along the lines of a 20-volume set created by a wide range of Book of Mormon scholars that each bring their specific areas of expertise to the table. It should include everything from theology to etymology to archaeology, etc., not just sprinkled with some of the extra juicy bits from each of these, but consistent chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and in some case, word by word analyses. I can tell you that there is legitimate interest in creating such a comprehensive commentary, and some preliminary discussions have taken place about doing that, but only time will tell if that project, in fact, moves forward. High-quality reference materials will be critical to the future of Book of Mormon research. My hope is that it can help break us out of what I call the echo chamber, wherein most of what is written about the Book of Mormon is by Mormon scholars and geared towards a Mormon audience. We've had a couple of our finest Latter-day Saint scholars break through the barrier, most notably Terrell Givens' By the Hand of Mormon and Grant Hardy's Understanding the Book of Mormon, both of which were published by Oxford University Press. As an aside, academic presses are quite interested in books on Mormonism right now. Primarily, not that they care about Mormonism, but they care about their bottom line. A typical academic book sells 1,000 to 2,000 copies, and a typical LDS book is selling about 10,000 copies. This was just in the news in the last week. It was so noteworthy that it was reported about. So the opportunity is there for publication, and we may be in the midst of another golden age. I consider the kind of the farms era to be a golden age. I mean, just the finest scholarship in the church was produced during that time. Now, as mentioned earlier, Mormon studies as a field is beginning to make some inroads in the larger religious studies community, but we need to do more to actually integrate the Book of Mormon into the larger field of Mormon studies and then work it into the field of religious studies. Some inroads are being made by simply approaching it as 19th century literature, which many faithful members may balk at, but it is the first step in elevating the profile of the Book of Mormon in academia. Regardless of its historicity, it is a piece of religious literature, and it should be put in conversation with other religious literature like the Gita, the Quran, etc. But we need to step up our game in order to incorporate the Book of Mormon into the realm of world scripture. We need to learn how to present its theology in a way that does not sound like a gospel principles manual. Now, there are many aspects of Book of Mormon research that are currently being explored that I simply don't have time to address. Things like the reception history. In other words, how is the Book of Mormon being used to shape the identity of the church as a whole? How has it affected the identification of groups traditionally labeled as Lamanites? How has it affected the way that whites have conceptualized or treated such groups? We haven't discussed gender approaches in the Book of Mormon, but there is actually a great deal of potential there as well. Now, to conclude, I think the future of Book of Mormon studies is very bright. There are exciting things happening, and there is much more yet to be done. Just at BYU and the Maxwell Institute, as I mentioned, we've got a new editorial board at the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. We've got the formation of the Book of Mormon Academy among faculty members in religious education. The Religious Studies Center is expressing renewed interest in scholarly approaches to the Book of Mormon. Outside of the campus bubble, or the compound, as I call it, we have the new Interpreter Journal, which has regularly been publishing first-rate articles about the Book of Mormon. And we here at the BMAF are looking toward the future in making our efforts both more scholarly and more readily available. My hope is that the younger generation will pursue Book of Mormon research from a variety of angles. It is a multifaceted book, and we need those who specialize in a broad range of fields. From more traditional approaches that we have been doing, like archaeology, anthropology, history, art history, linguistics, epigraphy, iconography, but also less obvious approaches like ethnobotany, literary specialists, geography, economics. Just last week I was able to speak to the chaplain seminar, all of the military chaplains in the church up at the church office building, and I had one of the chaplains say, has anybody done like a really nice military study of the Book of Mormon? And I referred him to some works done by farms, of course. But we also need people studying theology and philosophy and science and rhetoric, etc. There are a lot of different ways to study this book. And I don't think this is just a pipe dream. Seeing the current crop of scholars and the younger generation, I think we actually are at the cusp of a renaissance in Book of Mormon research. And I'm very anxious to see what the future will bring. Joe Spencer, I'm going to go to another slide here. If you can. Joe Spencer, who I've mentioned a few times before, my co-associate editor at the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, he shared his hope for the future of Book of Mormon studies. He said, we need then to do all we can to get a wider range of academics working on the Book of Mormon, at the very least so that we can begin to see how much more is at work in the text than that we've tended to see. Grateful for all that has been done, it's time to widen the scope of what can be done so that we have a broader vision of what this text accomplishes. For me, I'd like to think of Book of Mormon studies actually as being prismatic, meaning the light is divided but not necessarily diminished. Just like the distinctive rays of color are inherently part of the unity of all colors, my hope is that one day the field of Book of Mormon studies will come to represent the unity of all of these beautiful rays of light being produced by different academic approaches. Thank you. I tried to run out the clock like Dan recommended, so I don't have time. Do I have time for questions?
You want to take one? Go ahead and take one question.
I'll take one very easy question. Kirk. Kerry Hull is brilliant. I've actually known him for years. I knew him in the just from archaeological conferences. He's a linguist, a Mayanist. He's a polyglot. He knows 15 languages. Not just sort of studied a little bit on his own. I mean, he's actually taught these at a university level. He has been teaching in Japan for the past several years. But the first time I ever did field work, actually, I hadn't even met the guy. I had a friend of a friend that says, oh yeah, he knows some people down in the Chorti area and kind of the border of Guatemala. I contacted him out of the blue. I'm like, you don't know me. I'm interested in studying the Chorti. He set everything up for me. He just said, show up at this hotel at this date, at this time, and everything will be ready for you. And it took about 3 or 4 years before somebody else pointed out to me, they're like, hey, do you know Kerry's Mormon? I'm like, you're kidding me. And so essentially what Kerry had done, there is still a lot of academic bias against Mormons. We might as well be studying UFOs or Bigfoot, to be honest. And he wanted to sort of prove himself academically so he could be taken seriously in the field. But last year, we were down in Antigua at a conference together, and I said, Kerry, have you ever thought about teaching in ancient scripture department? And he's like, no, I've applied over in anthropology before, but I've never really considered religious education. And then a few months later, he emailed me and he's like, I've been fasting and praying and thinking about this, and I think I'm going to apply. And so he did, but he has works. I mean, his CV is a mile long. He's got just publications in all of our top journals. He's got books co-published with the best scholars in the field. His PhD is from UT Austin, graduated in 2004. His main focus was, or his dissertation was called, I don't remember the name of it, but it's about poetic discourse among the modern Chorti, and then reading that back into classic Maya texts. So he basically has found chiasmus, parallelism, etc. in the ancient Maya texts, which our conference last year in Antigua was dedicated to that entire subject, which is fascinating. So very well respected in the field. I'm curious to see what him coming to religious education is going to do to his reputation in the field, just because, I mean, he's established a good reputation, but the bias is so strong, I'm really anxious to see what's going to happen. All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you.